But I actually get, again, I'm coming from the place of the person who has done these things. I was just critiquing myself. And for this archetypical fictional person that I'm, drafting, the idea of things like cultural appropriation and white people telling people of color what they should and should not think are some of the greatest sins in the world. And yet deconstruction depends on those two things to exist at all in the first place. The Bible was not written by white people, and it was not written by people in positions of power or people with any kind of wealth or affluence.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Things You Don't Hear in Church podcast. My name is Ethan.
And my name is Derry.
And guys, thank you so much for coming back and listening again to a great episode that we're going to have. You guys can find us all over social media, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. We're on Spotify, iTunes, everywhere you find podcasts.
I haven't heard iTunes in a long time. Apple Podcasts, yeah.
iTunes, yeah, sure. Apple Podcasts, Mo better. But yeah, also, if you guys want to support the show, we got a Patreon. Mm-hmm. Without further ado, let's get into the show.
Yeah, today we have a really cool guest. His name is Josh Porter. He's an artist. He's a pastor in Washington, and he's got a new book out called The Death to Deconstruction. So we're having him on today to talk about suffering in our lives, how it works as being a Christian, and this deconstruction movement that's happening. And I think a lot of people deconstruct because of the problem of suffering. At least a lot of people I know, among a lot of other problems as well with Christianity that we've covered on the podcast. So, Josh, welcome on the show. Anything I missed that you want to plug?
No, I mean, that's a great setup. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So maybe let's start with a little bit of your story. How do you relate to deconstruction, to suffering? I know you have a lot of really good music that I love personally from your band Showbread back in the day that really communicates that in a very raw way that I really appreciate. But what has your story been with this whole thing it's very new? It's very like a fad now to deconstruct, but it's something that you have dealt with in the past a lot. So can you tell us a little bit about your story?
Yeah, I have all the classic landmarks for a great deconstruction story. I was raised in southern Georgia, the deep south, in a rural area. I grew up going to a fundamentalist, kind of conservative, severely right-leaning Southern church, and I was exposed, from really the beginnings of my church experience on to the kind of hypocrisy that all of us experience if you hang around people, not just church. Yeah. But mine was colored by Christian nationalism and militarism, and specifically an enormous amount of racism. And then I discovered punk rock and started this band and traveled all around the world for years and years and years. And everyone I knew at that point, that's obviously hyperbolic, but it felt as if everyone I knew that had kind of risen from this youth group culture in which I was raised, they were slowly, over time, on a long enough timeline, bailing out on the idea of first church, and then eventually what we would call like the Orthodox Christian tradition or the historic apostolic Christian tradition, and kind of dismantling, and the word later became deconstructing the theology ideas that they were given at some point in their upbringing, and erecting in its place a new quasi-spirituality, a patchwork spirituality where they're grabbing pieces from. Usually, it would be, I think, generous to say that they're actually borrowing from other religions and traditions. But what's probably more accurate is that they're borrowing from like YouTube videos and podcasts and what somebody said on their social media feed. And I like that quote, so I'm going to take a little bit of Buddhism from this quote, or whatever, Eastern mysticism, and eventually, I think because that kind of loose, threadbare spirituality can't really sustain it. It can't build community around itself because there is no standard by which one lives or no idea around which people can, huddle. That falls apart too, and eventually just leads to a kind of deconversion and neo-agnosticism, where there's like, I'm open to spirituality, but don't have any, or don't have any kind of developed spirituality to speak of. So that was happening probably from, the early 2000s when I first set off on the road. The gradual process of that was beginning to take place, and I was seeing it firsthand. And I was getting, bumping up against a lot of questions about, well, what do you believe? You're drawn to all these ideas that are outside of the box, and art that is certainly outside of the box and really confrontational. Are you really going to hang on to this thing? So I have all the pieces, and like anybody, I have suffering in my story and pain in my story as well. And so I bumped up against everything that usually derails faith in the kind of evangelical fairy tale. But somehow now, 39 years old, I haven't really changed my perspective, and that I'm still drawn to outside ideas that are outside of the box, and still drawn to confrontational art and all those things, and still think of myself as punk rock, even though I'm a dad and a pastor now. But I am, I'm more grounded in the ancient historic Christian tradition than I have ever been. And so as as a pastor, started having conversations with people who are my age when I was beginning to go on that quote unquote deconstruction journey, or to confront deconstruction, on the precipice of deconstruction. They're asking me very sincerely, like, how did you make it? Like, they're telling me, oh, these are the things that I'm confronting and that I'm dealing with. And I'm like, yeah, I remember that. And here's what mine was like. And I got a whole lot of, how in the world are you still a Christian? So then I wrote a book about it. That's how that came about.
Nice.
How long has this book been in process? Like, when did you first have the idea, like, oh, I should probably write on this because I think I have help that can for other people?
It gestated for a while because I comment on the deconstruction, I would call it fad. I realize that sounds like a pejorative, but I've been commenting as a pastor on the deconstruction fad in sermons and writing for a very long time. And it's something that both fascinates me and kind of aggravates me, and it is part of my story as well. So I set out to write about it. When I first sat down to write about it, I assumed that I was going to write something that was like intellectual or more intellectual, and I'm going to present these ironclad arguments against the classic reasons that people deconstruct. And when I sat down to write that book, I realized that book exists several times over, and they're really good. Like, if someone asked me for that book, I could say, oh, read this and this and this. And so I ended up writing something that used more of my story, which wasn't interesting to me in the beginning. I'm not like a memoir person. But I am I read so much more fiction than I read nonfiction. So I had to force myself to read a lot of nonfiction to, prepare for this book or research for this book. And I found that, at least in my own personal experience, and it's not extremely narrow. I've, traveled the world and have been a pastor now for many years. Deconstruction is intellectual degree, and there are all these kind of mind problems that derail faith, which is why a million of those books exist, and a lot of them are good. But in my experience, it's often more so emotional and reactive. It's about, I was hurt, or this thing happened to me. I have religious trauma, I have church trauma, and I just don't want to do it anymore. We don't often word it that way. We tend to word it as if we are passive parties to an experience that we can't control. So people will say, I just couldn't do it. Or, I just was, it happened to me. Deconstruction happened to me, rather than I, taking
chose to deconstruct
responsibility as an adult.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I have autonomy, and I just don't want to do it anymore. I choose not to do it anymore. Because, there's all kinds of reasons for that, victim culture and outrage culture and that kind of thing. But it is extremely emotional and volatile. And I'm not even using emotional as a pejorative. It makes sense that it's emotional. Mine was emotional, not purely. It's intellectual as well. So I ended up writing a book that is really, I think, emotion. I didn't realize that I had done it until I handed the manuscript to a few people to read, and they were like, "Oh man, it's pretty harrowing. There's a lot of pain, and there's a lot of, one guy that I gave it to a close friend for feedback, and he's like, it honestly reminds me of the fiction you write. It's like pain, 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 and then there's redemption, and so that's probably not what you get when you sit down to read like an apologetic book about
Right.
good reasons why these things in the Bible make sense. But I figured I might as well offer a different genre to an already well-rounded conversation. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. When you talk about that you went from this questioning things to a place of evolving to following the more traditional version of Christianity, right? We work in the deconstruction area a ton because that's what our podcast is centered around. It's helping people with those questions, whether emotional that they're going through or intellectual. And at least to me, it seems like the people we talk to the most go in these few directions. Either you completely deconvert and you go to some kind of like optimistic nihilism, like an agnostic atheist kind of thing. And there's a ton of podcasts out there. It's very popular right now. Or you'll go to some kind of progressive Christianity. You'll just affirm inerrancy, which I think people are still Christians, but a lot of people will go to just like a symbolic form of everything. And it gets very dangerous, kind of on the edge out there. And you see classic examples of like Bart Ehrman, the king of agnostic atheists, did exactly that after he became a Bible scholar and then eventually became an atheist.
Right.
Or people will go and do what you've done in finding a much more traditional version of Christianity that's much more historic to cling on to. So can you explain to us how you got there a little bit and what that looks like?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of talk about good and bad deconstruction, which I totally understand. One of the first combative things that I heard when I announced the book at all, they're like, death to deconstruction. Like, deconstruction's a good thing. What about good deconstruction? What about healthy deconstruction? And there's a couple of reasons for it. One, I thought it was a cool title. It sounds pretty punk rock. Two, I think that in the pop culture spiritual conversation, deconstruction has become a junk drawer term that usually means to jettison one's faith in some sense or another. When we say deconstruction, or when you read like an article in Christianity Today or Relevant or something, and they put deconstruction in the title of the article, we know that means people who were Christians and are no longer Christians in any meaningful sense. So what I do in the book is argue that it's probably just more helpful to adapt the vocabulary around the deconstruction conversation. You could use any number of terms. I prefer transformation of faith or spiritual formation in general. Yeah. Everyone who follows Jesus has to transform their faith over time. Yeah. Everyone who sets out on this, ancient way of life has to evolve their faith, evolve their practice. And not only do you have to do it like it's intended as part of the process of, apprenticeship. When you apprentice a master, you don't just inherit a set of beliefs and then stagnate. Mm-hmm. You grow in mastery, and that means changing your methodology and the ways that you think. And so I think that, that's one of the misconceptions is that, they're the same thing. They're not the same thing. I think that, the analogy that I like to use is that transformation or spiritual formation is like renovating a house. It's still the same house. You stay in the house. You don't leave the house. But you can do drastic things to adapt the livability of the house, the layout of the house. And deconstruction is a demolition project by definition. I mean, by the name itself, it means tearing it down. And if you do build something else, it's not going to be that house anymore. It's going to be something else entirely. And I realize, it's word semantics and everything, but I think that that's kind of where the conversation has gone and where the terminology has gone. So, I agree with you guys. I think that, what often happens is that deconstruction, at least, light deconstruction, eventually becomes a kind of deconversion, if not outright deconversion, because it's not a tenable way to carry out one's worldview, that half in, half out. I believe some of Christianity, but not all of it. Mm-hmm. And historically, there's a lot of precedents for it, especially when you kind of remove any of the kind of core tenets of the Christian movement for hundreds and hundreds of years. The moment that you say something like, "Oh, well, I think Jesus is wrong about this thing," or "I no longer believe that these parts of the Bible are true," and I'm
Right.
not talking about nuanced, complicated conversation with lots of intelligence and blah. I just mean like, "Nope, that's gone." Then it becomes increasingly difficult to hold the thing up because once you say, "Oh, well, I think Jesus is wrong about this thing or the Bible's wrong about this thing," that's fine. But now what are we going off of? If if Jesus is wrong about this thing, then why do we follow him at all? And if part of the Bible's wrong, why not just drop the Bible? And once you drop the Bible, it's like, well, that's kind of where we get it all.
Right.
So if we don't have that anymore, what's the point? So I think that outright deconversion, for me personally, has more integrity than deconstruction because it has the wherewithal to just say, I just don't believe it. And it doesn't make any sense to say I believe some but not all to suit my kind of personal preferences. I might as well just say I don't believe it. I'm out. And there are legitimate reasons that people have. Obviously, there's very smart atheists and agnostics in the world, and there's very intelligent people from other worldviews and religions. So it's not like, oh, you're a dummy if you don't believe. It's not for everybody, and I feel fine with that. I think that for me, remaining in the house of orthodoxy or the countryside of orthodoxy, because it is a wide countryside with lots of different traditions. That like you said, Derry, that they're Christians, even if we have differences in theology and practice that make our traditions unique expressions. I've been a Protestant Christian all my life. I read regularly from Catholic theologians. I'm part of a non-denominational church, but I read and am influenced by Methodists and Baptists. I'm not Reformed by any stretch of the imagination, but I read from Reformed scholars. So I'm happy to have all these people as sisters and brothers in the tradition. But I think when you stay, and if you evolve, meaning you're not remaining kind of complacent in your apprenticeship to Jesus, eventually that's where you end up. You either bail or you evolve to the point of like rediscovering the historicity of the Christian tradition and realizing that it's bigger than you thought it was, and the beauty of that, and that even though orthodoxy feels for a lot of, especially the kind of ex-evangelical crowd and the progressive crowd, feels really stifling. To me, it's a beautiful, it defines the movement for me. It's almost as if like, who are we if we don't have a creed or a code by which we believe and live? So the things like the creeds and the things like the core tenets of, the Christian tradition, the kind of things that when people come into our church and like, what do you guys believe? They're often disappointed that it's so broad, or disappointed that it's so specific, that read the Apostles' Creed and we'll read the Nicene Creed and we'll say we believe these things about God, these things about the Bible, the kind of stuff that you'd find if you just clicked on doctrinal statement to your normal church.
Right.
I think that's where faith leads. It leads to a maturing of perspective, which inevitably becomes a broadening of perspective, but it remains within orthodoxy, within the Christian tradition.
Yeah, so when it comes to deconstruction, and like a lot of people are like pushing against like what they've grown up with, and you were talking even about how you grew up in a fundamentalist church, what do you think, and maybe there's not one answer, but like in your opinion, what is like the reason or the main thing people are like, why are people deconstructing or deconverting so rampantly, it seems, in this culture? Because it seems like people have always had these questions about Christianity. The philosophical questions are not new questions that we don't know how to answer.
Before Christ.
Yeah, it's like 2,000 years of church history we have on our side to help process these. And I love what you're saying about the countryside of Christianity, because there's like Eastern Orthodoxy, there's the I forgot what the Asian
Catholics, progressives,
Catholics, Protestants, so many different types of Christianity all over the world.
And if you go to Protestants in Asia, it's completely different than Protestants here.
Yep.
Yeah. And so it seems to be like, are people deconstructing because they're thinking of Christianity only as what their experience of Christianity is, and they're not aware of all these different other forms? Or what do you think that is?
I think it's exactly that personally, and I think there's actually data to back that up. We in the Western world, and it's not all bad. It sounds like I'm beating up on and calling people ignorant. I belong to the Western world as well, but we tend to kind of assume our narrow perspective speaks for the world, and an increasingly globalized culture because of social media. We just kind of assume that we have our finger on the pulse of global culture, and it's not really true, especially since Western aesthetics and Western ideologies kind of dominate social media conversations and the globalization, the culture of globalization. So it's not an accurate read of reality. I was just reading a couple of weeks ago that a prominent demographer, a historian, and researcher, a PhD, who spends a lot of time studying world religion, published a report of her research and claimed that the majority of Christians in the world are in Africa, Asia, Latin America, Oceania. The majority of Christians in the world, or the majority of those Christians, are in Africa. The majority of those Christians are women, and the median age of those Christians is 19 years old, which means that we tend to think, in the West, oh my gosh, evangelicalism's dead, and which, evangelicalism's not a helpful word anymore. It's become entirely political.
Right.
So I get that, dismiss that. But we think of the Protestant, kind of mainstream Protestant expression of church in America is breaking down and dying, and all that's left are, right-wing fundamentalists, and everyone else is deconstructed. But again, I know that this sounds like I'm really stepping on toes, but statistically speaking, deconstruction is a movement mostly relegated to white, affluent American millennials. Statistically speaking, it is not happening all over the world the way that it is happening in America. And the reason is because the average Christian, globally speaking, is not the white, well-off, 20-something podcaster in California. The average Christian is a teenage girl in Nigeria.
Yeah.
And all around the world, the perspective on the scriptures and the church and affection for the things that we poo-poo in the Western world, like, ew, church, or the Bible's got weird stuff, that kind of thing, is just not happening. In fact, I was reading about a pastor from the West Coast who traveled to, I want to say it was Africa, and was spending time amongst Christians there who were meeting in secret, and they were wary of him bringing in what they described as like a corrupting cynicism from the West. They're like, no, we just want to be Christians, and we want to love the scriptures, and we want to follow Jesus. We don't want all the, like poking and prodding. And he was deeply humbled by, like, oh my God, they're trying to like actually keep the real thing going without it being poisoned by the the stuff, which is an incredible irony, because I'm stereotyping a bit here, but the quintessential kind of stereotypical figurehead of the deconstruction movement is usually someone who's left-leaning and quasi-progressive on not just the socio-political spectrum, but the kind of theological spectrum as well. And for this archetypical fictional person that I'm drafting, the idea of things like cultural appropriation and white people telling people of color what they should and should not think are some of the greatest sins in the world. And yet deconstruction depends on those two things to exist at all in the first place. The Bible was not written by white people, and it was not written by people in positions of power or people with any kind of wealth or affluence. And yet you have these like, white progressive millennials pointing at people in a different culture, people of color, people with no power, oppressed people, and saying, "No, you're wrong. You don't know anything. You're uneducated, and you're oppressive. You're actually oppressing me by the things that you're writing." And and saying, you know what, if I do take any of the things that you have to say, I'm going to change them. I'm going to make them what I want them to be.
Right.
So it becomes this kind of, I know these are, again, strong words, but it becomes almost like this colonizing, culturally appropriating thing to deconstruct, which is, again, why I think that just saying I'm just out has more integrity than saying like, nah, I'm going to do it the way that I want to do it, even at the expense of these people in other cultures and around the world, because I just know more. I know more than they do.
Wow.
That makes a lot of sense. So with some of the rest of our time, we'd love to go into the topic of suffering. We know that a lot of people deconstruct because of this problem. It's one of like the top 2 problems besides church abuse that people usually cite statistically as to why they walk away from the faith. They don't understand how God could allow this kind of evil in the world, maybe evil they've experienced, evil they've seen, and still be a good God. So can you speak into that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I in the book I categorize what I think are, at least in my experience, the 5 main, I call them great predators, but the 5 main issues that tend to derail faith in the deconstruction conversation. And the problem of evil is one of them for me. And maybe the lion's share of conversations I've had with people who are deconstructing, it's pain and suffering. And I know that I've been really, snarky and volatile about the stuff that I've said, but I actually again, I'm coming from the place of the person who has done these things. I was just critiquing myself. I was the person who was like, oh, I don't know if this stuff in the Bible is, I think maybe I know better. So if I sound critical, it is, from experience of being the person that I am criticizing. Well, the problem of evil is different. I think that, we tend to, as people, quantify levels of pain and assign certain levels of validity to pain, like, oh, well, if this happens to you, then you're right to be hurting. But if this happens to you get over it. You're okay. Or we do the thing, it's a common social media war tactic to be like, oh, really? First world, this other thing is happening. Therefore, your pain has been invalidated because there's more pain in the world, which becomes like a pain measuring contest. But I think, that pain is pain. And I'm not saying that, some pain is not more significant than other pain. I just mean that we all hurt. Pain is universal to the human experience, and suffering is as well. So I get it. And, I'm a person who's been like weirdly drawn to pain, not like in a, sadomasochistic kind of way, but like I'm fascinated by it. I have experienced a lot of pain in my own life, emotionally and psychologically. And even though it took me 30 years to actually have something actually tragic happen to me, most of my life was pretty comfortable. But pain was always something that fascinated me or was on my mind. And that was one of the main issues that poised itself to derail my faith personally. For me, the idea that God is responsible for pain, or God engineers pain to teach us special lessons, is something untenable. For me, the idea that God has created a world that's free, and this is not a new or novel concept. This is the most ancient perspective from the early church. The idea that God has created a universe that's free, that has autonomy, and that he has done so, as C.S. Lewis would put it, like in the name of love. For love to exist, freedom has to exist, that whole thing. And that within that created order that God engineered beings, and there are spiritual beings, again, not a new concept, as ancient as the and earlier than the Jesus movement itself. And that there's autonomy in both realms, and that they overlap, so that there's a physical world and a spiritual world. They're distinct realities, but they overlap, and that God has created creatures, things in both realms that have freedom and autonomy. And then, to me, the connection almost makes itself when you have people, and our experience confirms this, when you have people and those people have autonomy and they have the choice between what's best for everyone and creation and the environment and the animal, what's best for the whole picture, or what I want, even if it's at the expense of other people and creation and everything else. eventually they will choose the latter. Like eventually they, meaning we will choose the latter. And I always argue for evidence of this, see all of human history, you know, or your own life. Just look at your own narrow experience. And when we choose that which is at the expense of others for the sake of ourselves, you don't have to be a theologian to deduce that those decisions have consequences, and those consequences have consequences. I mean, now right down at a mathematical level, we have chaos, which confirms that, like, incidents don't happen in a vacuum. A seemingly simple incident has drastic consequences on a massive scale for a sufficiently complex system, and the universe is a sufficiently complex system. So I think that it virtually sidesteps the problem of evil to grant autonomy to human beings, to spiritual beings in particular, which for me resolves the issue of like the natural evil, hurricanes and tsunamis and that kind of thing. The fact that the world is just broken. It was created good, but it's broken down. And again, not huge theological gymnastics to get there. I'm just following the level story of the scriptures and the story of the history of the church and how they've worked that out. So that doesn't resolve pain, but it does get God out of the hot seat. For me, to consistently follow Jesus, that was a roadblock. The idea that okay, well, if God somehow ordains or determines or writes out, child abuse or or rape or war, genocide, kinds of things, then I honestly don't really blame people for deconstructing their faith. One anecdote that I mentioned in the book is that a friend of mine was asked to host a group of people who it ostensibly it was to be for people who aren't Christians. They come in. It's a whole thing. It's a guided curriculum. They sit faith-based conversations, and somehow out of this really unconventional format, people come to faith in Jesus. It's hosted by churches. So he was asked to be the first host for the first group. It's called Alpha, that was meeting. And in that first group, he realized that there were a dozen people there. None of them were, like completely new to the idea of church Christianity, the Bible. In fact, they were all former Christians, and they had all deconstructed their faith because of the problem of evil. And every single one of them, because they were told at some point that God ordains and structures and predetermines suffering and pain and evil for the big picture. It's really important to him that that's just the best way to do it. And there are Christians, legitimate Christians, who believe that, but he ended up saying to this group of people, like, you don't have to believe that to be a Christian, right? Like, there's, in fact, arguably most Christians in the world don't believe that. And there was like, oh my God, I had no idea. That's just what I was handed. And it was handed to me as the only perspective rather than this is our theological position, but there are others.
Yeah.
With countryside of orthodoxy. So I think that, sometimes the way I put it in the book is that people are mad at a cow for not being a dolphin. It's fine if you have an issue with the problem of evil. We all do. It's a problem. It's in the name.
Yep.
But to be bent out of shape at, oh, God, he causes this suffering, and God, he does, to me is like taking issue with something that most Christians don't even believe in the first place. Arguably most Christians, certainly most Christians don't believe in the first place. And we have other viable positions that present a different worldview or a different resolution for the problem of evil.
Wow. When it comes to conversations like that, where you present someone with like, well, not every Christian believes this. I know a lot of people we talk to, and even myself, we love control so much. We want to be certain, like, this is how it is. Like, the Bible says this. I don't like that there's other streams. Like, that's even a critique that a lot of non-Christians have for Christians. Like, you have so many denominations. Like, how could you believe all the same thing and stuff like that? We don't, obviously, but we agree on the core tenets, right? So a lot of people want that certainty and deconstruct or say that they can't believe in God or they can't believe in Christianity because there isn't this certainty. They have an amount of evidence that's been presented to them, but for them, it's not enough to be 100% certain. Have you seen that affect this deconstruction movement at all?
I have, yeah. I think that the desire for certainty, and I don't know this to be true, you'd have to ask like a sociologist, but it seems to me that it's uniquely present in our generation. We have just this extreme anxiety about things like waiting. Extreme anxiety. I mean, look at the way that the pandemic unraveled the sanity of the world because no one could just say what was actually going on. No one could say, okay, look, we understand this thing completely. We know what it does and doesn't do. No one could say, here's when life will go back to normal. No one could say, oh, okay, here's why we were disagreeing and we've resolved those disagreements. Instead, you had just like abject chaos where, understandably, science was rushing to catch up with something that was new and strange. And so, again, understandably, science was undertaking the often clumsy process of learning and discovering and saying like, oh, you know what? Actually, we've learned this now. So that last thing wasn't totally right. And people were like, oh, my God, we can't believe the idea that we can't believe anything anymore. They told us that we had to spray surfaces, but now we don't have to spray surfaces. Everything's a lie. And then the idea that like people just had to be in a position to say, when will things go back to normal? I just don't know. The people in positions of power were like, we just don't know. And I witnessed, people, my peers, people in my church, my friends, they were just coming unglued by this. Like, why can't we know? Because we've been trained to maintain certain expectations and then have those expectations fulfilled. You order the thing on Amazon, it comes in 2 days. That's Amazon Prime. And now people, and I'm one of them, that are used to this kind of format, this exchange, are like, it's been 2 days. Where the heck is the thing? What's going on? Now I'm mad. And should I contact someone? Should I be outraged? We've completely forgotten the whole please allow 6 to 8 weeks for delivery format of the world. And the problem with the scriptures is that they were written into a world where patience was not only necessary, but it was presupposed. Imagine the way that the New Testament was transmitted, where one dude writes one letter and then rolls it up and hands it to one dude, and he goes, travels for days and days and days to another church, opens it and reads it, and they're like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. And then somebody else has to now become responsible for the contents of that letter and carry it to a different place. And during that process, churches still have communication with one another, albeit very slow. So they're saying, oh my God, wait till you see this thing that Paul sent to the church in Corinthians. It's even crazier than the last letter he sent. And you would just have to say, I guess we'll get it in some months if he's not dead. We have to trust God that God will get us that letter somehow. So we now, even the way that we assume historicity works itself out is so different from the ancient world. We think of like reliable history in severely modern terms. And in the ancient world, which thrived on the oral tradition, which just means this girl comes to us from her town and says, I have been entrusted with the doctrine from Paul. Here's what it is, and they're like, thanks, Phoebe. And then she's like, all right, well, I'm going to the next place. And they, this is reliable history. They just told me a story about what Jesus did. So I think that the certainty sickness is absolutely, fundamental to the deconstruction phenomenon. But the issue is that you will not get certainty anywhere you go. That we have the illusion of certainty. We have Amazon Prime certainty, which we also learned doesn't always work. So if what you're after is certainty and you're going to bail on Christianity because you can't get it there or because it's not as modernly cohesive as you would like it to be, you don't like the idea of different streams and expressions and theological disagreement that can seem really significant from one camp to another. Go try a different worldview and you will be disappointed by the results. The same is true of not just every world religion, but the same is true of just, philosophical points of view about existence. So I think that at some point we have to resolve ourselves to a certain amount of mystery in the world.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that there are not like important core things we can know about God and ourselves. We can't know everything, and that's just the nature of being human.
Yeah, I think it's honestly one of the biggest sins of like our Enlightenment era is playing God, and we feel like we should know everything. It should be certain, hard lined, and no one wants to make terms or make friends with our like obvious subjectiveness. Like we just like put it out of our minds. And we're like, no, I'm not going to think this. Like I can know everything because there's so much information, and like it's gonna be what it is. And we have these theological discussions because we think we can actually get to the bottom of it because we genuinely believe in objective truth. That's something that's good that we should believe in. And like it's the core tenet of what we like the foundation of our whole religion and worldview. But we go from there to saying that everything I believe needs to be the objective truth and I can find it. Where we should be able to say we can have faith that this is what we think is legit and is the objective truth, but have the perspective to say I'm still a subject like being that can't absolutely know everything, and I can have an amount of confidence in this, like 90%, 80%, 70%, and then put my faith in it and continue to walk that out as my worldview. And it honestly it's caused a lot of people I know like a lot of heartache because we can't have 100% certainty that this is like the truth of the matter. Yeah,
it's really interesting because I've been thinking about this in the last few days about being a disciple of Christ, and one of the probably the best things we can do is realize that we don't have control. And I think giving up the illusion of control as you're discipling under Jesus is like adds a lot of peace to your life, you know. And it's like as I become older, I become more respectful of the Reformed theology and the idea of sovereignty. Whereas I don't go all the way there, but I'm just like, just knowing God's in control and I'm his disciple and he's teaching me and he's directing me and things happen I might not understand why, but I can just release control. I have found relieves a lot of anxiety because then I'm not trying to assert my will over my life. I'm subject to whatever God brings to me, and there's obviously responsibility to be taken in some degree. But I think that helps so many people. Like I think I would assume a good amount of Christians probably handled COVID a lot better than a lot of non-Christians because there's that sense of, hey, like I don't understand, but God does, and I'm just releasing, and that brings some peace that can help us like go through the storm.
It's part of fear of the Lord too, right? Like when you surrender to your subjectiveness and say like, Lord, like you obviously know what is right and I don't. I'm going to continue to trust in you even though I don't know all of the tenets of my theology are true.
Yeah, right. I mean, you guys are essentially describing self-denial, which is the prerequisite to following Jesus, not like the black belt level advancement in apprenticeship, but the prerequisite is to surrender autonomy over to a master and assume the position of the student. You're the master, you're in charge, I'm the student, I am subject to your authority, which I think grates against the modern sensibility in a way that can scarcely be overstated. And yet, I agree. I think that the surrender of autonomy is one of the most comforting, freeing, counterintuitively freeing things that I've experienced in discipleship to Jesus. Think about the way that psychologists argue that children who receive consistent loving discipline are statistically more confident. They're the children who, move about and obviously kids have different personalities, but statistically speaking, are more confident in group settings, more sure of themselves. And the psychological argument is that they have grown to understand that their parents are in control of the scariness of the world and they're not. So when they violate what their parents' wishes, there will be some kind of correction that takes place, which subconsciously confirms in a child's mind, like, oh, I'm not in control. I'm not the boss. They're the boss. And then that allows me to hand over to them a certain amount of trust that like they don't even let me do what I want to do. So they're going to take care of me. They have my best interest in mind, and then they become confident.
Wow.
I think that is true of disciples and a master. When you're an apprentice, I want to have a master who knows what the heck they're talking about, and I want to surrender my apprenticeship over to them. When I've sat down in my life to learn from a mentor, I did not go, yeah, but I've got a lot of thoughts and I want to tell you what I think. It's like I came and would actually say out loud, and this is a thing that I've actually done, sat with years under a mentor to learn a certain trade and say like, you tell me how to do it. I defer to you. I don't want to make it. If I could do it myself, I wouldn't be here. So you tell me what to do and I will do what you tell me. And then they trust me to grow and learn and, have more freedom and more confidence in what I have learned. And that's the beauty of apprenticeship. The idea of being like walking side by side rather than behind Jesus as master and teacher and Lord is entirely unappealing to me. I can just do what I want if I want to do what I want.
Yeah.
I would rather surrender autonomy to Jesus, even though I know that that's, blasphemous to the modern sensibility.
Yeah, so as we come to the end of our time here, we have started to ask all of our guests this question as a means to help our listeners navigate all the questions of the Christian faith that they might come across. So we want to ask you, what do you think, and maybe we've talked already about it with the suffering thing, but what was something or the one thing that comes to mind when you think of like the hardest question you faced in your Christian journey, and how did you overcome that to still follow Jesus?
Suffering was a huge thing, but to give you a variant answer, and maybe something that was equally so, was overcoming or accepting the crappiness of people. I am a very cynical person by nature, very pessimistic by nature, not a good thing. And have been throughout my life. Hopefully I'm maturing and growing all the time, but have been deeply kind of self-absorbed and narcissistic. And so I would kind of take on this perspective that, oh, this has failed me, so screw this. Whether be it an institution or an individual or a group of people, an idea. If I could carve out some kind of perspective for myself that I knew better, then screw this. I know better. Or if something failed me, by a violation of the terms of what I assume are friendship or authority or parents, pastors, teachers, that kind of thing, well then forget you. I don't care about what you have to say. And deeply rebellious by nature. Again, not always a good thing. In fact, most of the time not a good thing. Occasionally a good thing in the right context. So I spent years and years desperately convincing myself that I could carry out my Christianity privately, as something that would transpire between me and God, because I was so special and so unique and so smart, and I knew so much better than, the people at church that were getting it wrong, that I was just going to do my own thing. I was going to do it my way. And at that point, I still had a lot of the core attributes of Christianness, I wouldn't even call it Christianity, but I still read my Bible and prayed, and I wasn't, completely off the deep end in that sense. But I just couldn't, I couldn't figure out church, man, the idea of community and doing it with other people. My church had been such a terrible experience, and I was, I wouldn't have admitted it, but I was embittered and really angry about it. I would say that I was justifiably, righteous anger if I had any. Or maybe I'd say, oh, I'm not angry. I don't even care. I just don't want to do it anymore, which was a lie. But at some point, again, if you go on that journey from less mature to mature, ideally, as you transform faith and you go in the process of spiritual formation, you realize that even if you just continue to read the Bible, not even really study it, but just on a surface level, you realize that Christianity is always and only carried out in the context of community, meaning with other disciples of Jesus, where there's some level of accountability and vulnerability. I mean, the New Testament just won't make any sense otherwise. It's like written exclusively to groups of people. Or when it is, a letter to an individual, it's in the context of that person's life in the community of God's people. Paul just presupposes that he's talking to groups, not individuals, and that they're going to have group issues, not individual issues. So that required a tremendous amount of pride swallowing and humility, and eventually back into a church building and and saying, you know what, maybe I don't know everything, and maybe these people won't be the kind of people that I prefer, and maybe they won't like the same things I like, and maybe they won't think I'm so smart and so special. But we're just going to show up, and we're really going to try and really participate. And then over the course of the following years, watched my faith transform in more significant ways than it ever had when I was trying to do the personal pan spirituality.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, Josh, thank you so much for coming on our show and sharing about Death to Deconstruction. Guys, make sure to get that. When does it drop? It's in a few weeks, right? By this time it comes out, it should be already out. But
November 15th.
November 15th. Yeah, so by the time this episode's release, will be within a few days of its release. So go check it out, guys. Death to Deconstruction. You can also find more of Josh Porter's sermons at Van City. If you look up Van City Church on any podcast or website, you'll find it, and he's got a lot of great sermons there. Josh, thank you so much for coming on, and you guys know where to find us. If you don't, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube.
TYDHC.
We have actually one interaction on Facebook ever. We found out the other week. We've never used Facebook.
forgot we were on there.
Someone liked one of our posts that was there. We're like, oh, all right. But yeah, thank you guys for coming back, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
All right. Sweet. Thank you so much, Josh.